I'm very happy to introduce to you this afternoon Lynn Emmanuel, Director of the Writing Program at the University of Pittsburgh, recipient of numerous awards and fellowships in remarkable 4 times. Born in New York, Professor Emmanuel has lived, worked, and traveled in North Africa, Europe, and the Near East. She holds degrees from Bennington College, the City College of New York, where she studied with Adrian Rich, and the University of Iowa. Growing up in a bohemian household, her father and many other relatives were artists, and Emmanuel has referred to family stories about her being nasty to Rothko's daughter in the sandbox. She was a permeable membrane and learned what it was to be a practitioner of art before she knew anything else. She first planned to be a painter, and visual perception is a primary trait of her work. In her still life poem, Ordinary Objects, from Hotel Fiesta, she writes, "I am letting them stand for everything I love, the light's unsteady scale across the glass, the hard brown grit of ants among the roses." Emmanuel's work has always foregrounded the artist's awareness of making, an insistence on the poem as made thing, as the epigraph to Then Suddenly underscores. The book is the subject of the book. In this most recent series of poems, she plays with notions of narrative and space as she focuses on the relationship between reader and writer. Keeping in mind Gertrude Stein's description of America as a space filled with moving, Emmanuel builds the book around a play on the word moving. One movement in the book is the shifting position of the reader, who at times is likened to God, yet who also lacks free will, and is in fact at times subsumed into the author's text, so that there is no you. She owns you. You are the dog. She's the leash you follow through the plot opening into the dark city. Even the author can tire of such a relationship, of the dark forest of this book, and the little trail of breadcrumbs she has to leave to guide the reader's movement through the work. The book, then, so much about movement, also critiques the movement of traditional narrative. As one poem says, someone must save us from the literalists and realists and narratives of the beginning and end. Emmanuel favors the openness of possibility, of image and voice, rather than the closure of plot, where the reader follows the writer like a prisoner into the sentence of the story. Though, as one poem says, the body is a thing having a beginning and a middle and an end, this is what the text struggles against. Rather than landscape pinned down by scenery, Emmanuel wants images to inherit the earth like kudzu spreading its ooze. As the speaker in one poem says, she abhors it when things happen outside the glass-windowed conservatory of the skull. What she loves is the idea of a voice, like a leaf with a finch on it, a voice like a sizzle of something cooking. In the end, Lynn Emmanuel, in trying to unwrite the world that is all around her, privileges voice, not narrative. Though in English, even a simile is a story, she writes, a voice is not a story, but a way of presiding over a story, if one were to happen by. Much happens by in these poems, and the perceptive and often humorous voice. This voice, which sizzles and sparks, does what the speaker of Soliloquy of the Depressed Book wants, erasing the boundaries between itself and us, between show and tell, master and slave, and we are left with an image of the world, a flickering, restless image, where finally reader and writer disappear. All that's left, a voice perched, like a finch on a leaf, between the end and the beginning. Please welcome Lynn Emmanuel.
I'm very happy to be here, and I'm also very happy to meet Sandra Meek, whose poems I know. I was saying that, I mean, this is my fifth reading in 5 days, and it's been, tiring. But I was saying that, if I had not done this, I would never have met her, and I've had a number of really great experiences here in Georgia. That was such a great introduction. It saves me an enormous amount of work in having to talk about my own poems. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut back and forth between some earlier work and the work in Then Suddenly. And I thought I would start with a poem called Stone Soup, in which the narrator takes charge of her own destiny and in fact imagines herself imagining the ingredients that would be necessary for her to be born. Stone soup. Oh, I think the only word you need to know, if you don't know it from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, it's tintintabulation, which is just a tinkly sound. And it does allude to a time when milkmen would come to the door bringing milk in baskets. She wanted to get born, so she invented a mother to hold the long wooden wand of a cooking spoon fast in her fist, the big black zero of the iron pot, the stone of the pig's knuckle, the buzz of the fridge, the tap scalding the soap into suds, the tureen dunked again and again. She invents the tintintabulation of the milkman's bottles in their wire clutch, in their wire basket, and the sigh of the clutch as he disappears, and the match that touches the gas burner, the blue root, the little tiara of yellow fire. Beyond the window, it's nearly dark. A sudsy ocean is coughing up a beach as gray and hard as poured concrete. She has set herself a task, like a train lugging its hard body to Portland. And so now she makes a father's coat come home from the day shift, its pockets drooping like the jowls of a hound, and his long black shoes with their dew of glitter under the fluorescent light of the breakfast nook, his mustache like a school janitor's brooms. She begins with talk of labor and of wages, his big hand turning over the leaves of the light and water bills like a boring book, and it will not be long now until she will make them make her from nothing, from a stone, from a pot. As Sandra said in her introduction, this is my latest book, Then Suddenly, is a book that kind of jousts with the reader. In a sense, almost accuses a reader of being a reader. So that the reader sometimes is accused of being this grand presence that hovers above the book. But in this poem, it's reader as fellow traveler. And the book is riddled with references to trains, mostly because in one sense, writing a book is envisioned as a kind of journey with a beginning and a middle and an end. And this really is a poem also about the vicariousness of reading, so that even if you've never seen something, even if you know nothing about something, you can get it in a book. Out of Metropolis. We're headed for empty-headedness, the featureless amnesias of Idaho, Nebraska, Nevada. These are states rich only in vowel sounds and alliteration. We're taking the train so we can see into the heart of America, framed in the windows, cool oblongs of light. We want cottages. We want farmhouses with peaked roofs, leashed by wood smoke to the clouds. We want the golden broth of sunlight ladled over ponds and meadows. Of course, we've never even seen a meadow, but now we can wade into one. up to our chins in the grassy welter, the long reach of our vision, grabbing up great handfuls and armloads of scenery at the clouds' white sail, at the bargain basement giveaway of clods and scat and cow pies. We want to feel half of America to the left of us, half to the right, ourselves like a spine, dividing the book in two, ourselves holding the whole great story together, and then suddenly the train pulls into the station and the scenery begins to creep forward, the ramshackle shapes of Main Street, a Chevy dozing at a ribbon of curb, and here is a hound and a trolley and streetlights on their long stems, and here is the little park and the park stuff, the homeless, the woman upholstered in a red dress, the bus out of town sunk to its chromium bumper in shadows, and the noise of a train is gathering momentum, is disappearing into the distance, and there's a name strolling across the landscape in the crisp script of a title page, as though this name were a signature on a contract, as though this name were the author of this story. When I was writing the book, I was reading a small novel, very short, no larger than a book of poems really, by a novelist named Nicholson Baker, and the title of the book is Vox, which is Latin for voice, and it's about phone sex. That's the ostensible subject. The real subject is about how people invent themselves when they are invisible to one another. And although it seemed unlikely, I realized that in some ways this was a wonderful metaphor for readers and writers in terms of a book of poems, because the whole transaction, in a sense, depends upon neither one knowing the other, and the writer having to invent a reader for herself, and the reader, in a sense, having to invent or make up a writer. So this plays on that notion. I think I have to just say a couple of things. Truffles are these big sort of mushroom fungal things that are dug up in France. They breed special pigs to dig them up. They're a great delicacy. And the other thing that I think I need to say is the word Brest is on the last few lines, and it's the town in France that used to have these wonderful red roofs, and then when it was bombed during the war, it now is all reconstructed with concrete. Dressing the parts. So finally, here we are. I am a kind of diction I can walk around in. I'm clothed in the 6-inch heels of words like arrogation and scurrility. And what are you wearing? Is it those boxer things again? I hope it is those boxer things, and nothing else except your eyes. I like your eyes. Do you like the way my feet are long, narrow, with toenails like tiny television screens? And hair is important. A fog of hair floating above the fields of the body, or the body as bald as a truffle, very French, swine on leashes, like you, my pig. I'm your truffle, and for you, reading is eating. When you were at the French restaurant eating baked crepes and vegetables in the manner of the Greeks, and you felt like you had read all of Leaves of Grass at one sitting. But wait, I see something between your teeth. It's a kiss, as wet and mobile as a fish in an aquarium. Oh, God, yes. Describe the lips. Describe what the lips are wearing. Is it that color called red as roofs of breast? That color that the lips of the you are wearing? That you, reader, that you are wearing? I have a number of poems from an earlier book that are set in a small town in Nevada. And although, in a sense, the ostensible plot is about, well, living in a small town, and also about the fact that the atomic bomb was being tested in part of the state during this period, it's also about language. This poem is called Blonde Bombshell, and it's about the sort of confusion that one might have if one were a child and going to the movies with your grandmother and hearing some creature that was on the screen described as a blonde bombshell. Because it really seems like a creature, this huge white thing, like Marilyn Monroe. Deuce Coupe is an old-fashioned car that just has very rounded bumpers and very rounded chrome and a lot of chrome. Okay. Blonde Bombshell. Love is boring and passé. All the old baggage of love, the bloody bric-a-brac of it, the bad, the gothic, the retrograde, the obscurantist hum and drum of love needs to be swept away. So, night after night, I sit in the dark of the Roxy Theater beside my grandmother with her shanks tied up in the tourniquets of rolled stockings and open myself like earth to rain to the blue fire of the movie screen where love surrenders suddenly to gangsters and to their cuties. There, in the narrow, mote-filled finger of light, is a blonde, so blinding, she's a blizzard, a huge spook, and lights up like the sun, the audience, in its galoshes. She bulges like a Deuce Coupe, and when we see her, we say goodbye to Kansas. She's everything, spare, cool, and clean, like a gas station on a dark night, or the cold, dependable light of rage coming in on schedule like a bus. I think among the problems that poets face is how to write about a subject that seems, in a sense, impossible to write about. I wanted to write about the testing of the A-bomb. And so what was I going to say? Gee, if you were living around it, it wasn't so good, and it heralded a lot of, political and national trouble. I mean, how are you going to write about the bomb? So instead, in a way, what I had to do was turn the tables on myself and decide to, in some way, embrace the bomb. And by that I mean that, in a sense, I wanted to talk about the absolute seductiveness of that technology at a certain moment when, if you were, say, a small mining town in Nevada, and you saw all the money that was being poured into the state for all of this kind of research and development, what you thought that might mean to you, and the excitement around the technology. So it starts out with a mining town, and then it goes on from there. A Davenport is, just an old word for sofa. And the sort of dramatic situation is my mother trying to bring in the detonation of the bomb on a radio. The planet Krypton. Outside the window, the McGill smelter sent a red dust down on the smoking yards of copper on the railroad tracks, freight ends disappearing into the congestion of an afternoon. Ely, Nevada lay dull and scuffed, a miner's boot toe worn away, dim, while my mother knelt before the Philco to coax the detonation from the static. From the Las Vegas Tonopah artillery and gunnery range, the sound of the atom bomb came biting like a swarm of bees, while we sat in the hot Nevada dark, delighted when the switch was tripped and the bomb hoisted up its silky, hooded, glittering, uncoiling length. It hissed and spit. It sizzled like a poker in a toddy. The bomb was no mind and all body. It sent a fire of static down the spine, and in the dark it seemed to glow like the coils of an electric stove. It stripped every leaf from every branch until a willow by a creek was a bouquet of switches, resinous, naked, flexible, and fine. Bathed in the light of K-Down Las Vegas, my crouched mother looked radioactive, swampy, like something from the planet Krypton. In the suave and brilliant wattage of the bomb, we were not poor. In the atom's fizz and pop, we heard possibility uncorked. Taffeta raps whispered on Davenports. A new planet bloomed above us, and in its light, even the stumps of cut pine trees gleamed like dinner plates. The world was beginning all over again, fresh and hot, and we could have anything we wanted. Okay, so another problem is how to describe a story that bores everyone, which is, say, a teenager's dissatisfaction with living in an oppressive small town with your parents and your grandparents. And I decided that one way to handle this material was to write about the food. So that different kinds of food represented actually the oppression. So I think the only thing that may be unfamiliar here is Haut-Brion, which is a really expensive French wine. And the other thing to know is that, in the 50s, the only antibiotic was penicillin. And you would so for parents to give penicillin to their kids, they would crush it up into this bitter white powder, put it on a spoon, and then put a glob of jelly on top. Say, here, and you'd take a mouthful and there would be that, that bitter grit. So you were fooled. What Ely was. It was the purple and the yellow of canned tamales. It was the dark silt of gravy burning, the homony's white knuckles, fat that made every surface gleam like a pigeon's neck, like a spill of gasoline. It was melt-down crusts of oleo on the tuna casserole, toast that was blackened to a piece of macadam, a singed field, a roof shingle. It was the cool unguent of jam on a spoon, but even that sweet thing had a sting, and it was good for you, that needle, that pin. Under the beautiful blue glass dome of plum preserves was the bite of penicillin. I longed for chocolate, both sweet and bitter, fried green plantain, mustard, onion, red tomato, rice and black beans in a pot, Moroccan olives with cayenne, Haut-Brion, cabbage, ham. Somewhere, some green coast exported all I wanted of all I wanted. There was a kingdom where my hunger fit, both mind and body, all of it. This next section begins with a quotation from Albert Einstein. Nothing moves until something happens. And this first poem I'm going to read to you is from my first book. It's called The Sleeping. And a couple of things. That it takes place in New York City. Sandra was kind enough to mention Mark Rothko, who was a very important abstract expressionist painter. He was a friend of my family's. My father was a painter. But if you don't know Rothko's work, you should know that it was incredibly severe. It was just blocks of color, one on top of the other, extremely abstract. And the other thing that's alluded to here is he committed suicide. The Sleeping. I have imagined all this. In 1940, my parents were in love and living in the loft on West 10th Street above Mark Rothko, who painted cabbage roses on their bedroom walls the night they got married. I can guess why he did it. My mother's hair was the color of yellow apples, and she wore a velvet hat with her pajamas. I was not born yet. I was as remote as starlight. It's hard for me to imagine that. My parents made love in a room full of roses, and I wasn't there. But now I am. My mother is blushing. This is the wonderful thing about art. It can bring back the dead. It can wake the sleeping, as it might have late that night when my father and mother made love above Rothko, who lay in the dark in his bed thinking, roses, roses, roses. This next poem begins with a quotation. This is the wonderful thing about art. It can bring back the dead. And this is a poem in which, in a sense, I make fun of my younger self. And all of that advice about, be careful what you wish for, you might get it. This poem also has a lot of mention of painters' names, and it's not important that you really know them, except for one, and that's the French surrealist Magritte. Anybody know Magritte? Know his paintings at all? Okay, two. Oh, brave souls, all right. He's got a famous painting. He uses bowler hats, just black bowler hats that are often sort of floating in space. And they're very spooky because they suggest both a person and the disappearance of a person at the same time. So the hat actually plays an important role in this poem. This is the wonderful thing about art. It can bring back the dead. Halfway through the book I'm writing, my father dies and is buried in his Brooks Brothers suit, but I can't seem to keep him underground. Suddenly, I turn around, and there he is, just as I'm getting a handle on the train pulls into the station poem. What gives, I ask him. I'm cold and dead, he says, and I say, Father, there is nothing I can do about all that. Get your mind off it. Help me with the poem about the train. I hate the poem about the train, he says, but since he's dead and I'm a patient woman, I turn back to that poem in which the crowds have gone home and the janitor pushes a big mustache of broom across the floor, and I ask, Dad, is that you in there? No, it is not. A black cloud in the shape of Magritte's bowler, plump and sleek and stark, hanging over the train station, says, the grave is like a broom closet, dank and small, and I want to go to a museum, put one in the poem beside the damn train station, where it is morning, and the ticket window is selling tickets to a man in a hat and an enormous trench coat, and a woman in white looks as cool as a martini in a chrome shaker, and a woman in red seethes in a doorway, and they are all so eager to become those who are beginning the journey, and from the horizon's molten light, the trains crawl out. And when I get to the museum, I want to see Soutine, Miro, Picasso, Dali. I want eyes in my armpits and my fingers, eyes in the air, the trees, the dirt. Father, I say, you already are an eye in the dirt. It's early morning. In a pine tree, I hear a Phoebe's stressed squeak. Phoebe, Phoebe. And it sounds like the creak of the old guard at the museum, snoozing in his rocker before Soutine's still life of the butchered cows. Father, I say, do you see them? And the Phoebe says, yes, squeak, yes, squeak, yes, squeak, yes, squeak. I think when you're writing poems that one of the odd experiences, and it's not, you don't always have it, but I have it at least intermittently, is that to be writing with the sense that somebody is going to read this, and in a sense that you are writing to a reader who in some way even controls what you put on the page. And so in a sense, as though the very page that you're writing were written for someone other than yourself. So this is a poem called Like God. You hover above this page, staring down on a small town. Outside a window, some scenery loafs, and here's a mongrel loping, and here is that train approaching the station in 3 long sentences, and here are the people in galoshes waiting. But you know this story about the galoshes is really about your life. So like a diver climbing down over the side of a boat, you climb sentence by sentence into this story on this page. And of course, you have been expecting yourself. As a woman who purrs by in a dress by Dior, as a porter manacled to luggage, as a man stalking across the page like a black cloud in a bad mood, these are your fellow travelers, and you are a face behind or inside their faces, a heartbeat in the volley of their heartbeats, as you choose out of all the journeys that of a man with a mustache scented with tobacco because he must be secretly sexy, you think, and your awareness drifts to his trench coat, which is worn and softened and flabby, like a coat with a lobotomy, just as the train pulls into the station. No, you want another stop in a later chapter where the climate is affable and sleek. But the passengers are disembarking, and you didn't choose to be in the story of the woman in the white dress, as cool and evil as a glass of radioactive milk. You didn't choose to be in the story of the matron, whose bosom is like the prow of a ship, and who's launched toward lunch at the Hotel Pierre. Or even the story of the dog on a leash, even though, reader, this is now your story. The story of the person who had to take the train and walk the dark road, described hurriedly by someone sitting at a desk so you could discover it, although you knew all along the road would be there. You who have been hovering above this page, holding this book in your hands, like God, reading. The other role that a reader has in this book is that of the police. And this is the reader who would ask, was this really about your father, that poem, or is this really your life? So this is called persona, which means mask. And a persona poem is a poem that's often written in somebody else's voice. Mount Monadnock is a big mountain in New Hampshire, on the New Hampshire-Vermont border. Persona. When the reader's radar tracked me down, I had given up and become a dead man. I throbbed in the big fog of his white shirt. I called down the long tunnel of his throat, "Oh, dead man, where are we going?" And he called back, "Everybody is a door. Open, enter, become." Then a door opened in a voluminous museum, and there he was, standing in the hallway of his coat, under a hat so big and shadowy, so riven with creases, that it looked like he was wearing Mount Monadnock on his head. And I shoved my head into the mouth of that tragic hat. I donned the trench coat with the lobotomy, and just like that, I was a man. On my finger, I bore the tourniquet of his ring, and I was happy inside my lonely rayon blazer when a voice said suddenly, "Lynn Emmanuel, is that you in there?" No, I said, standing here clothed in the raiment of a dead man. No, said the voice of the dead man, limping up and down the stairs of my voice. No, 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 said the voice of the dead man, limping down the long, dark corridor of my throat. This is an anti-nature poem. I wrote it, it's not actually an anti-nature poem, but it's a poem against certain traditions of writing about nature. And I wrote it because, of course, if you're a poet, you're expected to have a certain respect for trees and flowers and find them beautiful and want to put a meadow in your poem, or at least that's one version of what poets do. But when my father died, for instance, I was sitting in a little cabin in the woods, and I would look out the window, and there were all the leaves falling off the trees, dying. And why should I love nature, since it was telling me that what I already knew? Everything dies, it doesn't come back. In Search of a Title, the last two words are the title, and the quotation from Rachel Carson is a real quotation. In Search of a Title, I'm sitting on the porch and the woods are still here. Can't the trees do something besides vertical? In the book review, I read that nature is making a comeback, which is one more thing to make me feel geeky and out of step. When is the literature of boarded up shore towns coming back? As usual, I'm staring at the woods, but the woods are a wall for turning sight away, a blindfold across my mind. I stare at them as though at the fire or at the red coverlet across my closed eyes and disappear into myself, where Rachel Carson is saying, if you understand nature, you will never be afraid or alone. So I've set myself this small, unpleasant task. Describe the tree as though you like it. Today, on the way to the studio, a dogwood hovered above me, so thick and bright, it was as though the woods had spun a ghost. Its pale and sloppily anthropomorphic form was more spacious and more flexible than tree. Humble and penetrating, those are words that occur to me. Also, dizzying freshet, but I reject that in favor of something less well-dressed. It's spiffy and impudent, the tree that is. That's why I like it. That white is a loose shirt tail, and does it seem like bragging to say, it reminds me of myself? I'd like to cast off symbolisms, the need to stuff thought and feeling into the strongbox of nature. What a giddy slosh of white ectoplasm the dogwood left on that blue sky. I'd like to just proceed, strolling along, side by side as it were, reader, immaculate but unkempt. White occurs to me, and naked. I'm going to end with the title poem of the book, in which the author erases everything that she has created. And when I moved from Denver, which is where I lived until I was about 14, to New York City, I was told by the people in New York City that I had an accent. And so one of the words that I used to say, or they claimed that I said it like this, is in this poem. Then suddenly, all bad poetry springs from genuine feeling. Oscar Wilde. I'm gonna have to get some water. Yes, in the distance there's a river and a bridge. There's a sun smeared to a rosy blur, red as a drop of blood on a slide. Under this sun, droves of poetry readers saunter home, almost unaware they're unemployed. I'm tired of the dark forest of this book and the little trail of breadcrumbs I have to leave so readers who say "garsh" a lot can get the hang of it and follow along. And so I begin to erase the forest and the trees, because trees depress me. Even the idea of a tree depresses me. I also erase the white aster of a street lamp's drooping face. I erase a dog named Arf. And I erase 4 cowboys in bolas. And yet, in the diminishing bustle of these streets, I nevertheless keep meeting people I know. I erase them. Now I am surrounded by the faces of strangers, which I also erase until there's only scenery. But I hate scenery. I wind rivers back on their spools. I unplug the bee from the socket of the honeysuckle, and the 4 black Angus that just walked in like a string quartet. Get a life, I tell them. Get a life in another world, because this is a page as bare and smooth as a bowling alley. And then suddenly, renouncing all matter, I am gone, and all that's left is voice, soaring, invisible, disembodied, gobbling up the landscape, an airborne cloud of selfhood, giving a poetry reading, at which, despite everything, reader, I have made our paths cross. Thank you.